Known as one of the best hip-hop albums of all time, It Takes a Nation is Public Enemy's second album. Upon its release, it sold 500,000 copies and garnered a lot of public reaction as its subject matter shocked audiences across America. The album was inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in 2013 and is known to be one of the best hip-hop albums of all time. So for this video, I'm going to dissect the album and break it down, look at its lyrical content, its production style and sound, look at the album cover, its influence, and also go back to the main point of the video of why it is so relevant, even though it's been a couple decades since its debut. It Takes a Nation was recorded from 1987 to 1988 in multiple sessions until its official release in 1988 by Def Jam Records. The group is comprised of Chuck D, who is the main rapper, Flava Flav, known for his hit show on VH1, Flavor of Love. He's famously known as the hype man in the group. He does a really good job at making audiences get excited, but he also does play a key role in providing ad-libs, iconic phrases, expressions, and sometimes going back and forth with Chuck D on their tracks. DJing for the group was Terminator X, and finally joining Public Enemy on stage in full military uniforms and replica Uzis was Security of the First World, better known as the S1Ws, who were led by Professor Griff. Now, when the album was released in the 80s, there was a lot going on in the USA, mainly pertaining civil rights issues. Now, I don't think America or the USA is any stranger towards a lot of civil rights and political issues. A lot of the major civil rights issues that were happening in America were due to the anti-apartheid movement that was happening across the nation. This movement provoked a lot of violence towards protesters who were calling for the end of apartheid, which only increased racial tensions across America, and this was mainly because a lot of the protesters were people of color. At the same time, there was also a huge wealth gap and division going on between the rich and the poor. This is still something that we see today. I want to quote Can't Stop Won't Stop by Jeff Chang. He talks about the 80s, and this was a significant moment for hip-hop. He says, between 1983 and 1989, the top 1% of households saw their net worth increase by 66%, while 4 out of 5 households saw their net worth decline. Families of color were hit even harder. And it wasn't until October 19, 1987, in which the bubble burst and stock market crashed, that there was a huge depression in America. Alongside all the racial tensions and violence and protests and civil rights and all the division between people's opinions on what was happening, the idea of unity amongst one another seemed very dim. Let's specifically talk about New York in the 80s. So alongside this major wealth gap, segregation and racial tensions were still at an all-time high, with parts of New York being split between black neighborhoods and white neighborhoods. For example, Brooklyn and Queens were still predominantly white, and there were many accounts of violence towards black people. With the fall of black leaders such as Malcolm X in the 60s, black civil rights leaders were having a hard time reaching and inspiring the youth. And again, I'm going to quote Can't Stop Won't Stop. By the mid-1980s, there was barely any continuity between youth organizers and activists who were emerging of necessity to address their own issues and a civil rights establishment who had long given up on developing young leaders. Almost all African Americans lived under conditions of increasing racial and economic isolation. So this meant that amongst all the other social issues that were happening in America, so with the anti-apartheid movement and civil rights issues and violence, there was the recession, the wealth gap, the crack and AIDS epidemic that hit New York in the 80s. A lot of youth in New York, particularly black youth, did not know who to turn to or to help inspire and motivate them. However, luckily in the same decade, hip-hop debuted as a emerging genre that gave youth in New York City something fun, you know? I mean, it did emerge as kind of like a dance genre, and people did think it was a fad, but with its debut came the success of groups like Run DMC and the Beastie Boys, and obviously Public Enemy debuted. They originally debuted with their first album, Yo Bum Rush the Show, and then they followed with what is considered one of the best hip-hop albums of all time, It Takes a Nation of Millions to Hold Us Back. I want to jump straight into its lyrical content, themes, and messaging. One of the reasons why It Takes a Nation is such a powerful and iconic album was that it was all about political consciousness. One of the most popular tracks from the album is Don't Believe the Hype, which criticizes the media and how it plays a huge role in manipulating people's perceptions. I think with social media being one of the main sources of information that we get today, this is more relevant than ever. Even things like hype relating to the idea of clout or news trends and stuff. I think that a lot of people can learn from this track on the album, in which, you know, reminding yourselves that the things that you see online or things that you see from different media sources aren't exactly the truth. Another track is Louder Than a Bomb, which speaks about how the government systems such as the CIA or FBI have actively oppressed society. I think this particularly relates to how the CIA or FBI that basically put drugs into certain communities, or obviously Black communities in America, and how that has worked against these communities and have oppressed them by keeping them reliant on drugs. We still do see these type of problems today, especially with like fentanyl and other opioids that are still destroying communities. One of my favorite songs from the album is Night of Living Baseheads. Now this is a commentary again on the crack epidemic in New York. If anyone knows anything about the history of New York, the crack epidemic was very bad for a lot of communities. So one of the reasons why I really like Night Living Baseheads is that I think overall it does give a very eye-opening message as to what crack and different opioids have done towards these communities and have done to New York in general, or just anyone who has unfortunately fallen into the addiction of drugs. Another track is Black Steel in the Hour of Chaos. Now this is one of Public Enemy's iconic tracks. It tells a story about how a Black man is imprisoned because he chooses not to fight in the Vietnam War. She Watched Channel Zero. This is another well-known song off the album. I personally find that the overall message makes sense. However, I do say it is a little bit sexist, but overall the song is about society's addiction towards TV programming and how essentially sitting in front of the TV all day and just watching useless shows is rotting your brain. Rebel Without a Pause. This is considered one of the most iconic songs in hip-hop in general. This song pays homage to the 1955 film Rebel Without a Cause that stars James Dean. The song is about teenage rebellion, racism, and essentially the general frustrations that Black youth feel against the American government. And finally, Party for Your Right to Fight, which is a track inspired by the Beastie Boys' You Gotta Fight for Your Right to Party, in which Chuck D spends a majority of the song calling for resistance against bias systems in America. So obviously a lot of the major themes of this album talk about distrust in the American government and media, as well as talking about racism, capitalism, police brutality, the American criminal justice system, a lot of commentary on biased media sources. You can also kind of tell that there's a really big theme about how different ways society has been oppressed by America, or by drugs, or just by the media. A lot of things that keep people's minds mentally down, which obviously affects how they can react and unify together to fight big issues and problems in America. Chuck D is an amazing rapper. He's one of the most well-known rappers in hip-hop, and you can literally hear how passionate and frustrated he is with the state of America. He really does hit harshly in his lyrics. One thing I do really like about the structure of Public Enemy between Chuck D and Flava Flav is that Flava Flav balances out the powerful raps made by Chuck D by delivering more playful, humorous ad-libs and expressions and dialogue throughout the album that give the album more wit, and also shows that they can poke fun and make jokes out of their enemies. So overall, lyrically, the album was a call for revolution, or basically a political awakening. If you can make your audience more politically conscious and aware of what is going on with things around them, then hopefully they can all unite and realize what issues they actually have to come together to properly fight and stand up against. Public Enemy really wanted to inspire and remind youth of who they are, where they come from, and why systems exist in America that keep them oppressed. Now, I want to talk about one of my favorite parts of the album as someone who is really into the production and sound styles of albums, and that is the sound of the album. Public Enemy was definitely one of the first to merge politics with hip-hop, especially with Yo Bum Rush the Show, but shortly after its release, what was happening to the sound of hip-hop was changing. If you aren't familiar with the term, sampling is basically where one track takes a beat, melody, sound, anything from another track and reuses it to make a new song. Public Enemy sampled a lot in their tracks. I think on average, Public Enemy's songs typically had around 10 samples in one song, and that is a lot because usually a song that samples has maybe 2 to 3 samples. Night of Living Baseheads actually has 21 samples in it, and that is an insane amount of samples. There's a big reason for why Public Enemy has so much sampling in their music, and that is because of the Bomb Squad. The Bomb Squad are a very integral part of Public Enemy. They basically have curated this sound of Public Enemy. The Bomb Squad was comprised of Chuck D, the Shaq Lee brothers, Hank and Keith, Eric V. Nam Sadler. The Bomb Squad were very deliberate with how they wanted the album to sound. Hank Shockley had explained that when we came onto the game, musicians said that we're not making music, we're making noise. So I said, noise, you want to hear noise? I wanted to go out by music's nightmare. The result of this led to the album sounding very harsh, loud, chaotic. There were so many sounds and samples. There obviously have Flava Flav and his ad-libs in it. It just sounded like a really chaotic orchestra. There were so many layers in the album, and I think people actually had a really hard time trying to catch every single sample that was included. And the samples weren't just samples of other songs. There was samples of, you know, Malcolm X speeches and samples from their crowds, and there's just so much different elements to every single song, which honestly made it really fun to listen to. So amongst all of their sampling, one of their most famous samples and inspirations for the album was James Brown. Among James Brown, there were some other famously sampled artists such as Sly and the Family Stone, the JBs, Slayer, Rufus Thomas, and Bob Marley. Hank Shocklee was devoted to creating a unique and experimental sound and breaking all the rules in music. In a 1990 interview with Keyboard magazine, he says, "We took whatever was annoying, threw it into a pot, and that's how we came out with this group. We believe that music is nothing but organized noise. You can take anything, street sounds, us talking, whatever you want, and make it music by organizing it. That's still our philosophy, to show people that this thing you call music is a lot more broader than you think it is." So something interesting that I want to mention about the album while I was listening through it was that yes, there's a lot going on production-wise and style-wise. There's many sounds, many samples. However, I do feel that the sound is really relevant towards the group itself. Like, you can really see the origins of who they are. There's so much sounds going on. There's the guitars, whistles, there's car honks and car alarms, there's people talking, there's crowd noises. And I think all these elements put together with the samples, and you have Chuck D's lyrics and you have Flava Flav in the background. There's like a sense of urgency and anxiousness. And if you grew up in New York in the 80s, these are a lot of similar feelings that people had at the time living there. Again, with all the things that were happening in America, socially wise, civil rights wise, with the drug problem, people felt really anxious and had this sense of urgency and danger living in New York all the time. So why not make the sound of the album also sound like and feel like what it was like to live in New York in the 80s? I just always thought that was interesting. Like, people always say that, oh, this listening to this album makes me feel like, you know, like lots happening. I feel really chaotic. I feel on edge. I mean, how do you think people in America felt in the 80s living in New York? They probably heard car honks and alarms and, you know, crowd noises and odd, like, you know, people noises outside, street noises. Like, these are really common things that you hear in the streets of New York City, and Public Enemy are staying true to who they are by incorporating these sounds into their album. So It Takes a Nation was truly trying to communicate the Black experience in America, not just through its lyrical content, but also through its sound and how it feels. Chuck D also explains this in an interview with Spin Magazine, where he says, "Rap is Black America's TV station. It gives a whole perspective of what exists and what Black life is about. And Black life doesn't get the total spectrum of information through anything else. They don't get it through print because kids won't pick up no magazines or no books, really, unless they got pictures of rap stars. They don't see themselves on TV. Number 2, Black radio stations have neglected giving out information. The only thing that gives the straight up facts on how the Black youth feel is a rap record. It's the number 1 communicator force and source in America right now." The album cover itself is really powerful. I always thought Public Enemy had really strong imagery. I mean, to be honest, every single element of Public Enemy has a really strong and powerful feeling and notion behind it. Yeah, I really like this album cover. And interestingly enough, the album cover was shot by Glenn E. Friedman. I hope I'm pronouncing that right, but he shot the album cover and he didn't like it because I guess as a photographer, he thought the composition of the photo was bad. Like, you can't see Chuck D's eyes, and I don't know, he just didn't really like the lighting, but Chuck D liked it and they egged for this to be the cover of the album. One thing that is interesting about the album is that it really does show a really strong statement with them being behind jail bars. The media has portrayed them to be bad guys, which is why they're behind jail bars, because they're such a powerful force that I guess media critics felt like had to be pushed back because they were speaking the truth, what was going on in America. Here's the back of the album, by the way. You can kind of see S1W, Public Enemy, I believe that's Terminator X over there, and then you just gonna see like all these like little jail cells, like it's like security camera footage. I have a couple Public Enemy records, is that they always have a notable quote on the album cover. And this one reads, "Freedom is a road seldom traveled by the multitude." So you can't free yourself on your own. You can only ever reach true freedom by working with your community, with society. Only as a society together, united, can we truly free ourselves. I don't know, I still feel really appalled thinking about how anyone could find this as a negative thing, but maybe it's just because I have compassion and I'm not like a racist bitch. So let's talk about the influence of the album. So Public Enemy didn't just break rules in hip-hop by the sound of the album. A lot of the reasons why they break rules was also because they were very directly calling out injustice in America. And obviously they went against every single rule in music by the orchestrated, organized sound and chaos and sound of the album with all the millions of samples. They didn't want to just make an album that could be easy listening or just popular. They really wanted to make a statement about who they are, where they came from, and what they believe in. Now, I did comment on this before, but It Takes a Nation and Public Enemy in general were very popular in the UK, but were also very popular to rock and metal fans, which I always thought to be very interesting, but also not that surprising. There's a lot of rebellious and hard-hitting, thrashy sounds that fit right in with punk and rock fans, because that is kind of similar to punk and rock music. And what Public Enemy was doing with how they depicted themselves and how they were going against so many things that were used to oppress them was very punk. This garnered a lot of fans from both the rock and metal genre. Now you can see there's like this emergence of like hip-hop fans and rock fans who were coming together because they both had this sense of appreciation for each other and what they both stood for. In an interview with Billboard, Hank Shocklee of the Bomb Squad shared how punk, rock, and metal had actually played a big part in what inspired the album. These two cultures that socially seemed like they were separated were actually the same. Metal and punk never got any radio play. It was never the established form of music in the 80s. It was this backdoor, listen with your headphones so nobody would know force of nature. I was working at a record store at the time Public Enemy had started that would deal primarily in metal and punk, and that energy really inspired me to do something similar in hip-hop. So it's no surprise that this album appealed to a lot of rock and metal fans. Even Kurt Cobain of Nirvana had listed It Takes a Nation on one of his top 25 albums in his journals. Since its release, the album has inspired thousands of musicians and hip-hop artists, especially production-wise. So most notably, obviously, NWA. Literally, some of Public Enemy's tracks, like if you listen to the album, if you know NWA songs, you'll be like, this sounds really similar. Because yeah, NWA was very much inspired by Public Enemy. What's crazy about the album is that even though it's been years and decades since its debut, a lot of its messages are still very relevant to this day. There is still a lot of fights and protests going on worldwide about the end of apartheid in certain areas of the world, i.e. Palestine and Israel. We're still facing a lot of social issues. Racism is still something that exists in America. Now more than ever, there's a lot of misinformation online because now maybe we're not attached to our TVs anymore, but we are definitely attached towards social media, which has a lot of different sources, not even just from the news anymore, but now we're getting information from other people who aren't even qualified to give information to begin with. So it just seems like now more than ever, a lot of the themes and messages in this album are just as relevant. And I think that's what makes this album so amazing and iconic, is that the messages are still just as important as they were important in the 80s. Kind of sad for us as a society because it's been a long time and we still haven't changed much, but also very iconic for Public Enemy. People ask the question as to like why we're so divided, even though there's so much information and so many ways that we can be politically aware and informed of what keeps us divided. But again, like Public Enemy have mentioned in their album many times, there's biased media sources, there's government systems at play that a lot of society can't see because they're so distracted. It's almost prophetic in its way. Like, I think Public Enemy have also, like, I'm pretty sure in some interviews, Public Enemy or Chuck D has also kind of described themselves as prophets of their time, because what they're saying was not only true for the 80s, but decades later, as we can see, is still very true and relevant today. Many believe that the 80s and 90s and 2000s were not as progressive and that we're the most progressive that we've ever been. But if that's the case, then why are we still dealing with a lot of the same issues that people in the 80s and 90s and 2000s are still dealing with? It just seems like decades have passed by, but a lot of us societally are still stuck and still dealing with a lot of these bigger encompassing issues, and we're now getting more distracted by even smaller forms of division. Like the title and like the quote on the album entails, we can't as a nation experience freedom. We can't be free from all these big systems of oppression unless we all come together to fight it. No one can experience or be free on their own unless everyone around you is also free.